big truck that carried Muhammad across the desert was now an all-purpose vehicle, transporting living, wounded, but mostly dead soldiers. Those killed Palestinians and Egyptians were piled atop one another in no specific order. And I think that particular moment, again, trying to imagine it from my father's point of view, I remember actually at one point going with him to Egypt. Every time he went to Egypt, he tried to find some of his old comrades from the war. So he would take me to these ailing Egyptian neighborhoods in Alexandria and in Cairo, and he would go and ask, do you know where's Muhammad Abu Shawish living? And people were like, no, nobody knows Muhammad. And then he would find out that that person actually died a long time ago. And then he would cry, and I was like, I've always felt really confused about who are these people that my father's always trying to trace back in Egypt, and why do they mean so much to him? In fact, I tried to write about it. I wrote about it in the book, and I tried to write about it to kind of really try to explain and help people understand this extremely unique relationship between Egyptians and Palestinians, especially Palestinians in Gaza. Those killed Palestinians and Egyptians were piled atop one another in no specific order. Some of the wounded were quietly uttering Quranic verses, those that one would recite before his last breath. The truck sped through Sinai, which was no longer barren, for it was speckled with burned vehicles, scattered bodies, and boots. There were so many boots, the exact same kind that Muhammad still held between his arms. They filled the desert like uprooted trees, and around them were barefooted men lying still. Of course, the whole boots notion, it's again is something that every Gazan understand the reference to boots in the Sinai desert. This is, as you know, the Egyptian air defenses were destroyed in the first few hours of the war, so they had no air cover whatsoever. And you had hundreds of thousands of soldiers, confused, betrayed, the leadership, the command, the central command was, everything was in tatters, and then they fought and they fought and they fought, and many of them died, thousands and thousands died, and in the end they realized it's a hopeless fight, so they began running in random order in this open space called the Sinai Desert. And as a result, you know, the boots were, of course, the cheap kind, very heavy. They took the boots and they threw them and they went running barefoot right in the desert. And as a result, you had boots covering large swathes of the Sinai Desert. So the reference to the boots, again, it's nothing that you would read in an academic elucidation of the history of the Palestinian people or the Egypt or the 1967 war, but it really meant so much to the just that extremely tragic image of all these men lying on the ground and around them nothing but boots and nothing else. There was a sense of betrayal and a defeat that was so deep-rooted in our psyche that took us so many years to get over. When Hezbollah defeated Israel, and it was a defeat in 2000 and 2006, that particular generation, my father's generation, understood that small defeat. I mean, in the greater scheme of things, it wasn't an astounding victory over Israel. But they kind of juxtaposed that to their defeat of 19. They needed something. They needed anything to make up for what has been lost. You know, that sense of shame that they carried with them throughout all of those years, that they wished not to talk about it at all. And it was somewhat, and I think there's some tragedy in this, that many of that generation actually died out before seeing the Arab revolutions underway right now. This would have been the unwritten chapter that would have satisfied people like my dad. Okay, maybe we haven't been taken back to Beit Daras, maybe we haven't retrieved our land and all of our rights, but at least we lived to see the moment where people like us, people like my dad, all the Muhammads of the Middle East, and all the Zarifas, and the Fatimas, and the Khadijas of the Middle East are now up in arms and reimposing themselves as part and parcel of change and shaping their own destiny and their own fate in the Middle East. That would have been kind of a good token for that generation. Many of them that kind of died out before seeing a glimpse of hope underway in the Middle East. I think I'm going to stop right there and see if you guys have any questions.
Thank you very much. I'd like to listen to some more. But let's have some questions from the audience, please, on this specific topic. That was the 1967 war you were referring
That's
to.
right.
Any discussion? Pam?
I'm just wondering how many people there were actually living in Gaza at the time of the 1948, and why all the refugees went there. Did they expect to go on through to Egypt?
Actually, there was about 80,000, and there were kind of a small Christian and Muslim aristocracy lived in the Gaza City area. I mean, aristocracy in a relative sense. They were largely nomadic tribes. Some areas were populated in the south, Khan Yunis, Deir Balah. The total number was estimated at 80,000. These guys, actually, it was a double tragedy for them. Some conflict ensued between them and the refugees. Again, that's the kind of things that we don't hear much about. But I think it's really important to understand, because the refugees came and eventually all these international organizations came and tried to provide help for the refugees. They were not classified as refugees, the 80,000. So they got nothing, they received nothing. They were originally poor and they became even poorer. So there was a bit of bitterness, and not even animosity, that actually took place at the time as a result of this. 200,000 of the Palestinian refugees that numbered around 800,000 at the time went to Gaza. The rest went to West Bank, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. At this point, I don't think there's one country in the world does not have a Palestinian refugee or someone with a refugee status. In fact, I worked for about 1 year in the Sultanate of Brunei. I was the only Palestinian in that country. And I always joked about it, because prior to that, my uncle was teaching at the university there. And he finished there and he left. And a few years later, I go back to be the chief editor of their newspaper. And he tells me, I am so glad that you are going there to kind of hold the refugee status of Palestinian refugees in Brunei, because otherwise there was no other refugee in the whole country. So it's like we're on a mission to kind of maintain that status until something fundamental happens and the issue is resolved. So Gaza was a choice based on distance and space issues. So those who lived in the southern parts of Palestine, the southern villages, chose to go there because they couldn't go through the other areas that were infiltrated already by the various Zionist militias. So they kind of, and of course not every, I mean, it's a choice you kind of have to take an element of risk, and it was very risky because many of those people died on the way there. They underestimated the distance. They've never really been through these areas. They did not take the open roads. They went through orchards. Lots of people died there as a result of snipers waiting for them. Some people found themselves being ambushed, and this is exactly how the Beit Daras massacre, in fact, took place, because the fighters were fighting the last battle, so they asked the women and the children to leave. And then they kind of thought that they found a safe passage for them, and then they left. And on the way out, they kind of ran into a Zionist militia, and they were just basically gunned down in the fields. So it's an element of risk that they had to take, but it was really largely based on the distance. They felt Gaza is closer to Egypt. We are in a safer zone than going somewhere else, and that's why they went.